You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult to...
William did not enter that room expecting to break. He arrived guarded, silent, and prepared for another difficult royal discussion. But when Earl Spencer stood before Charles and revealed what he called Camilla's succession plot, the air changed instantly. One sentence cut through years of restraint, and the future king's composure collapsed in front of the very family he had been trained never to expose himself before. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Spencer did not reveal it through a careless whisper or a passing rumor. He revealed it through a documented private account, a sealed folder, and a recorded conversation summary he said had been preserved after a confidential palace exchange. The private palace meeting had been arranged as a quiet attempt to steady the family, a closed discussion meant to repair trust after months of tension. Succession, in plain terms, means the order and process by which the crown passes from one monarch to the next, and that made the accusation more dangerous than any ordinary family argument. Charles understood it instantly. The king had expected difficult words about unity, loyalty, and old wounds. He had not expected his wife's name to be tied to a hidden effort that Spencer said was designed to influence the future around William before he ever fully held it. William stared at the table as the words landed. The prince tried to breathe through the pressure, but Spencer pressed harder, saying Diana's sons had been pushed to the edge of enough palace conversations already, and that this time, silence would be betrayal. Charles sat motionless. The monarch's hands rested near the folder, but he did not touch it, because touching it would mean accepting that the accusation had entered the room as evidence, not emotion. Then Spencer placed the sealed file in the center of the table and said Camilla's name with cold precision. The queen consort was not there, yet her absence filled every corner of the meeting. William's jaw tightened. He had heard attacks before. He had survived headlines, distance, duty, and grief. But this was different, because Spencer was not speaking as an enemy of the palace. He was speaking as Diana's brother, and every word carried the weight of a woman the prince had spent his life mourning, in public restraint and private pain. Charles finally looked toward his son, and saw something worse than anger. He saw hurt. The future king's eyes had changed, and in that change, the room understood the truth. The revelation had not ended anything. It had opened the question that could destroy everyone. Who knew, who stayed silent, and who stood to gain? But before the palace could understand the accusation, it had to face the people trapped inside it. And every one of them had something devastating to lose. This was not just a clash between royals. It was a collision between memory, duty, ambition, and blood. William carried the burden of Diana's son and Britain's future king. Charles carried the shame of a father caught between his wife and his heir. Earl Spencer carried the anger of a brother who had never forgiven the palace. And Camilla stood at the center of a storm she could no longer control. The room had not recovered from the first accusation, but already the meaning of it was spreading through every face. William was not simply hearing that someone had challenged him. The prince was hearing that his future may have been quietly discussed as something to be managed, softened, and surrounded before he ever touched the crown. The heir, in plain terms, is the person next in line to become monarch, and that made William's position more than personal pride. It was the future shape of the monarchy itself. Charles knew that. The king had spent his life waiting for the crown, and now he was watching his own son face the same burden under the shadow of mistrust. Spencer did not speak like a man chasing drama. He spoke like a brother carrying grief that had hardened over years, and he revealed the details through the same documented account and recorded conversation summary he had brought into the meeting. The folder contained notes, meeting references, and one proposed wording change tied to succession consultation powers. Consultation powers simply meant who would be allowed to advise or influence decisions around the next reign, and that phrase made William's face change. It was not about ceremony anymore, it was about control. Camilla's name sat behind every line Spencer read, even when the queen consort was not in the room. He said her circle had pushed the phrase, protective continuity, a polished term that sounded harmless, until its meaning became clear. To William, it meant his authority could be wrapped in guidance before he ever had the chance to use it freely. Charles tightened his mouth, because the monarch understood the danger. If he defended Camilla too quickly, he risked losing his son. If he accepted Spencer too easily, he wounded his wife beyond repair. William looked at the king, and for a moment the prince was not a future ruler. He was a son asking whether his father had seen the warning signs and looked away. Spencer kept his voice steady, but his anger was unmistakable. He was not only accusing Camilla, he was defending Diana's sons in the only language the palace could not ignore: files, names, dates, and consequence. The storm had found every person it meant to wound, and when the palace traced the accusation back to its origin, one private incident emerged as the spark that turned suspicion into war. Every royal disaster has a beginning no one notices until it is too late. For this one, it was not a speech, not a balcony appearance, and not a public scandal. It was a closed-door Windsor dinner 3 months earlier, when Camilla challenged William's future authority in front of 2 senior courtiers. That private sentence became the trigger everyone later remembered as the moment the family line was crossed. Camilla had spoken softly that night, but the meaning was sharp. She questioned whether William should inherit full family decision-making authority without what she called a stabilizing advisory arrangement. An advisory arrangement, in simple terms, meant a small circle of trusted people allowed to guide major royal decisions before and after the crown passed forward. To Charles, it sounded cautious. To the Queen Consort, it sounded practical. But to anyone listening closely, it placed a quiet question mark over the future king before he had even begun. Charles dismissed it then. The king believed his wife was trying to protect the family from sudden change, not weaken his son. He told himself that difficult families needed careful language, and careful language did not always mean conspiracy. But Spencer later learned through a copied private note and a documented palace account that the same phrase had appeared again, this time beside references to succession influence, royal household oversight, and Camilla's advisory role. That discovery changed everything. Spencer sat alone at Althorpe with the copied note in his hand. Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, mattered because it was tied to Diana's memory and to the grief her brother still carried like a duty. He reached the words, "protective continuity," stopped reading, and closed his hand around the page. Protective continuity sounded harmless, almost noble, but Spencer saw the danger inside it. It meant William could be surrounded before he could lead. It meant the prince might inherit the crown, while others shaped the room around him. William later remembered being told that Windsor dinner meant nothing. The prince had accepted that answer because he wanted peace, and because part of him still wanted to believe Charles would never let palace language become a weapon against him. Now that trust felt painfully naive. Charles felt the same memory returning with a colder edge. The monarch realized the sentence he had ignored may have grown roots while he looked away. Camilla's single question had become more than dinner conversation. It had become the first crack in the line of trust. So the brother who had once buried Diana before the world walked back into the royal machine, carrying the sentence that would make William break. The confrontation began with silence, but it did not stay silent for long. Earl Spencer did not raise his voice at first. He simply looked at Charles, then at William, and said the one name everyone was avoiding: Camilla. The room tightened around that word. William looked down. Charles looked away. And Spencer opened the folder, as though he were opening a wound the monarchy had spent decades trying to seal. Spencer stood across from the king with a calm that felt more dangerous than anger. William sat nearby, rigid and pale, holding himself together with the kind of control the prince had learned in childhood. Charles watched both men, and the monarch seemed to understand that whatever came next would not be softened by rank, age, or family history. Spencer said the Queen Consort had encouraged a succession influence plan meant to preserve her voice after Charles's reign. A succession influence plan, in plain words, meant an informal structure designed to shape the next monarch's decisions from behind the scenes. That mattered because William was not just a son in that room, he was the future king, and any hidden pressure around him would become pressure around the crown itself. Spencer revealed the accusation through the documented account, the copied notes, and the recorded conversation summary already placed inside the folder. Then he read the line that changed the temperature completely. Protective continuity must remain active during transition. Charles set his glasses down slowly. The king's face tightened, not with disbelief, but with pain. He asked Spencer whether he understood the damage of what he was saying. Spencer answered that Diana's sons had already lost enough to palace compromise, and that silence had done more damage than truth ever could. William's breathing changed. The prince heard his mother's name without anyone speaking it directly, and that was what broke through him. Camilla was absent, yet every sentence seemed to pull her closer. Spencer said the plan would have made William king in name, while others quietly shaped the family behind him. That was the blow. The future king lowered his head, and the grief he had fought to bury came through in one sudden, devastating crack. Charles reached toward him, then stopped, because the monarch knew comfort would not erase what had been exposed. Spencer did not celebrate. He looked wounded too, as if forcing the truth into that room had cost him something. The confrontation had finally said what everyone feared, but it had not solved who could stop it. But tears could not settle what had been exposed, because inside the palace, feeling was never enough unless someone held the authority to act. Behind every crown is a machinery the public rarely sees. Not jewels, not ceremony, not balcony smiles, but signatures, access, advice, and permission. After Spencer's accusation, the palace no longer looked like a family home. It looked like a battlefield of files and loyalties. Charles had to decide whether Camilla's influence was a private matter, a constitutional danger, or the final test of his reign. Charles sat alone after the meeting, staring at the folder as if it had become heavier than the crown itself. The king had survived public judgment before, but this was different, because the danger had entered his own family through private language and quiet arrangements. Sovereign authority, in simple terms, meant Charles still held the final power as monarch, the person at the top of the royal structure. Yet William's future depended on more than the legal line. The prince also needed control over household arrangements, private briefings, advisory access, and succession preparation, because those were the tools that could shape a reign before it began. Charles opened the folder once, then closed it again. The monarch could see the difference now. Spencer had not accused Camilla of changing the legal line of succession, the official order of who inherits the crown. He had accused the queen consort of helping shape who would advise, brief, and influence William when the moment came. That made the plan more subtle, and in some ways more dangerous. It did not steal the crown, it surrounded it. William's grief hardened into control. The future king told an aide, quietly but firmly, that he would not inherit a crown already wrapped in hidden conditions. The prince had spent his life preparing to serve, but service did not mean walking into a future designed by people who doubted him. Charles heard those words later, and they struck him with force. The king realized his son was no longer asking for reassurance. He was demanding protection. Then a senior private secretary confirmed the detail that made the room go still. The same Windsor dinner phrase had appeared in more than one internal note. Protective continuity was not an isolated phrase. It had traveled. It had been repeated. It had gained shape. Charles stood, pressed his hand flat against the folder, and issued the order no one expected. All succession advisory discussions connected to Camilla's office would be temporarily frozen until he personally reviewed every file. The monarch's decision did not calm the palace. It sent a shock through it, and when the order moved through the corridors, the first person to feel the ground shift beneath her was the woman whose name had started the crisis. Camilla did not need a public announcement to know the palace had changed. She heard it in the shorter answers. She saw it in the avoided eyes. Then came the message. Charles had frozen all succession advisory discussions connected to her office. No speech was given. No explanation softened it. A door simply closed, and for the first time, she understood that the accusation had reached the center of power. Camilla sat still after the message was delivered. The queen consort did not raise her voice, did not demand the aide repeat himself, did not reach for Charles. She simply removed her reading glasses and placed them down with a calm so sharp it frightened the room. Succession-related briefings, in plain words, were private updates about the future transfer of royal duty, influence, and preparation around the next monarch. Losing access to those briefings meant her office had been pushed away from the most sensitive conversations about William's future. That mattered, because the prince was not only Charles's son, he was the next center of the crown, and whoever shaped his preparation could shape the mood of an entire reign. Charles knew the cost of his own order. The king had defended Camilla through storms before, but this time, protecting his wife meant risking his heir, and protecting William meant wounding the woman he had spent decades standing beside. Palace aides were instructed to send sensitive heir-related matters directly through Charles and William only. No side channel, no soft language, no advisory circle connected to Camilla's staff. The queen consort listened as the instructions settled around her like a verdict. An aide waited for anger. Instead, he saw something colder. Camilla looked toward the closed door and said nothing, and that silence carried more threat than any outburst could have. William learned soon after that Spencer's folder contained another phrase: future family continuity. To the prince, it sounded like coded control, another polished term meant to make influence appear harmless. He had already heard protective continuity. Now this new line felt like proof that the language had not stopped at one dinner, one note, or one careless suggestion. Charles felt the walls closing in from both sides. The monarch had frozen the machinery, but he had not healed the wound. Camilla's humiliation had begun, William's mistrust had deepened, and Spencer's evidence had forced the palace into a place protocol could not reach. But beyond Camilla's closed door, father and son were about to face each other without aides, titles, or anyone left to absorb the pain. For once, there was no council table between them. No secretary, no ceremonial language, just Charles and William in a private room, both carrying the wreckage of the same woman's name for different reasons. The monarch looked older than he had that morning. The future king looked less angry than broken. And when the door shut, duty finally gave way to the truth neither man could escape. Charles spoke first, but the king did not sound like a ruler. He sounded like a father afraid of the answer. He asked William whether he truly believed Camilla had meant to undermine him, whether the queen consort had crossed from caution into control. William did not answer quickly. The prince had spent years choosing careful words around pain, but careful words had not protected him from this. He said, intent mattered less than the fact that he had been discussed like a problem to be managed. A succession advisory framework, in plain terms, meant the structure of people, briefings, and influence around the next monarch before power fully passed to him. That mattered because it could shape William's reign before the country ever saw it begin. Charles lowered his eyes. The monarch finally understood that defending Camilla without question may have made his son feel unprotected inside his own family. William's voice softened, and that made the moment worse. He told Charles that Diana's memory could not keep being treated as collateral damage whenever the palace wanted peace. Collateral damage meant someone being hurt as a side effect of protecting something else, and for the prince, that wound had followed him since childhood. Charles did not interrupt. The king listened as William said he was tired of being asked to absorb pain for the sake of stability, tired of pretending that silence was strength, and tired of watching his mother's name return only when the family needed to survive a crisis. Then the room changed. Charles reached for Spencer's folder and pushed it toward William. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of an admission. He told his son, "Then we correct it now." William looked at the folder, then back at his father, and something in the prince steadied. He did not forgive everything in that moment. He did not forget Camilla's name in the files, or Spencer's voice, or the phrase that had broken him. But he saw the king choose him clearly. Charles said the framework would be rewritten with William's authority protected, and no hidden condition would stand around the future crown. Father and son had reached the decision privately. But privacy could not hold it for long. By morning, what had begun behind closed doors was no longer just a family rupture. It had become the story Britain could not look away from. The next morning, the monarchy woke to a country already speaking in whispers. The story had moved beyond palace walls. It was on breakfast tables, phone screens, and outside the gates, where cameras waited for any sign of movement. A private accusation had become a public reckoning, and one newspaper front page captured the national mood with 5 brutal words: William breaks under palace betrayal. William watched the coverage without speaking. The prince stood still as the headline moved from one broadcaster to another, each voice repeating the same painful shape of the story. Spencer had confronted Charles, Camilla's influence had been frozen, and the future king had broken under the weight of it. A public reckoning, in simple words, meant a private royal crisis had become something the whole country judged. That mattered, because the monarchy survives on trust, and trust can disappear faster outside the palace than inside it. Outside Kensington Palace, crowds gathered quietly. Kensington Palace, the London residence closely tied to William's family life and Diana's memory, became the place where public sympathy gathered first. Some people carried flowers. Some held signs with Diana's name. Others simply waited, as if silence itself could say what speeches could not. William saw a clip of the crowd and looked away. When a presenter mentioned Diana, the prince turned the television off. He had endured public grief before, but this felt different, because the nation was no longer only mourning his mother, it was defending her son. Charles felt the change immediately. The king had managed scandals, ceremonies, and storms of opinion, but this story moved beyond protocol. Protocol, in plain terms, meant the formal rules and habits used to keep royal life controlled. Yet no rule could control a country that saw William's pain as proof that the palace had failed him. Broadcasters framed the crisis not as gossip, but as a battle over trust inside the future of the crown. That framing terrified Charles, because it made the issue bigger than Camilla, bigger than Spencer, and bigger than one closed-door confrontation. Then came the palace response. It confirmed that succession advisory discussions were under review, and those few careful words gave the public what it needed, proof that something serious had happened. Camilla heard the response too, and the queen consort understood the distance it created around her name. Spencer's documented account had traveled farther than he ever needed to speak again. William's silence had become louder than any statement, and once the nation had chosen what it believed, Charles had only one duty left: to decide what this crisis would mean forever. In the end, the monarchy survived, not because the accusation disappeared, but because the family finally stopped pretending it had not cut deep. Charles made his decision. William found his voice. Spencer forced the palace to confront a wound it had hidden behind ceremony for too long. And Camilla learned that influence has limits when it touches the future king's trust and Diana's memory. Charles delivered the final internal decision with a calm that sounded almost painful. The king confirmed that all succession advisory planning would be rewritten, with William's authority fully protected, and no informal influence channel would remain attached to Camilla's office. Succession advisory planning, in simple words, meant the private preparation around who guides, briefs, and supports the next monarch before the crown passes forward. That mattered because a future reign can be shaped long before the public sees the crown change hands. Charles understood that now. The monarch privately acknowledged that he could not demand William's loyalty while leaving uncertainty around his future authority. The prince had given enough silence to the palace. He had carried enough grief behind duty. And this time, the king chose not to ask his son to absorb another wound for the sake of calm. William did not celebrate Camilla's setback. The future king did not treat the decision like victory, because nothing about it felt clean. He simply felt the burden of doubt begin to lift. Spencer's role settled into its final shape too. He remained the painful outsider, the man who forced the family to hear what it had avoided, even when the truth shattered the room. Spencer had revealed the accusation through a documented account, copied notes, and a recorded conversation summary, and now those sources had changed the course of the family conversation forever. Camilla's consequence was clear. The queen consort remained inside the royal structure, but her influence over succession preparation was ended. She had not been erased, but she had been stopped at the exact line William believed should never have been crossed. Charles knew the cost. The king had protected his son and wounded his wife, but he also restored something the crown needed more than comfort: trust. William left the palace alone, pausing before stepping into the car, composed again, but visibly changed. The prince did not look broken anymore. He looked marked by what had happened, and steadier because of it. There was no mystery left by the end, only the hard truth that William's breakdown had become the moment the monarchy finally chose its future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.